Hey guys. Tonight we're going north. Not the north of the adventure novels with the gold rush and the dogs sleds racing through dramatic landscapes toward dramatic destinations. Tonight we're going to the actual north. The Alaskan interior in February. The kind of north where the thermometer reads 40 below and the sun sets at 3 in the afternoon, and the nearest neighbor is 11 miles away and the mail comes when the conditions allow it, which is not the same as when you need it. Tonight we're talking about the homesteader. Not the famous one. Not the one who wrote the memoir that got published and the documentary that got made. The ordinary one. The one who filed a claim on 160 acres under the Alaska Homestead Act, built a cabin before the first snow, cut what seemed like enough wood in September, and spent the following months learning what enough actually meant in a landscape that had its own very specific ideas about the terms of human habitation. Tonight we're talking about survival as an education. The kind you can only get from the thing itself. So before we begin, if this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. Drop your city and time in the comments. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the sound of a wood stove working through the night, and the specific silence of a landscape that has several feet of snow on it, and is not apologizing. Now, let the warmth around you become deliberate. Let it be warmth you chose and maintained and understand the cost of. And let's begin where every Alaskan homestead story begins. In August, when everything still seems possible. You filed the claim in August. Not because August was the right time to file a homestead claim in Alaska. Because August was the last time that filing felt possible before the window closed. Before the rivers froze and the passes filled and the particular combination of distance and whether that Alaska deploys against human ambition became something that even determination couldn't argue with. The land office was a wooden building in a town that was itself a collection of wooden buildings arranged around the primary question of how to exist at this latitude without freezing. The man behind the counter processed your paperwork with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times and the specific expression of someone who had also watched many of the people whose paperwork he processed come back through his door 2 or 3 years later having reconsidered their relationship with 160 Alaskan acres. He did not say anything discouraging. That was not his job. You had 160 acres. The Homestead Act of 1862 had been extended to Alaska after 1898, and the terms were the same terms that had applied to Kansas and Nebraska and the Oklahoma Territory in the decades before. 5 years of continuous residence, a certain number of acres under cultivation, a modest filing fee, and the land was yours. The federal government's position was that Alaska was empty and needed filling and that people willing to fill it deserved to be compensated for the attempt. The federal government's understanding of what empty meant, and what Alaska's understanding of empty meant were not identical, but that distinction would become clearer over the following months. The historical truth about Alaskan homesteading is that it operated on a timeline that the lower 48 experience of homesteading did not fully prepare people for. Between 1898 and 1986, when the program ended, approximately 360,000 acres were homesteaded in Alaska. The peak period was the 1940s through the 1960s, when veterans returning from the Second World War and people looking for a different kind of life arrived in numbers that the existing Alaskan infrastructure was not designed to accommodate, and the landscape was not designed to encourage. They came with varying levels of preparation. The consistent variable was the tendency to underestimate what preparation was required, not because they were naive, exactly, but because the preparation required for Alaskan homesteading was not the kind that could be acquired anywhere except Alaska, and most of them had not been to Alaska before they filed the claim. The fringe detail about the homestead requirement is the one about cultivation. The federal requirement for homestead proof included a sworn affidavit of continuous residence and cultivation, the same requirement that applied in Iowa and Missouri and the agricultural heartland of the continent. The problem was that Alaska's growing season, in the interior, ran from late May to early September. The soil in many areas sat above permafrost that limited root depth and drainage. The crops that the continental homestead tradition assumed were not the crops that Alaskan conditions supported. The General Land Office evaluated cultivation claims from Alaska with what the historical record describes as flexibility. Some homesteaders grew hay. Some grew potatoes in the specific well-drained areas where potatoes were possible. Some grew the particular combination of root vegetables that the short season and the acidic soil would accept. The federal documents describe this as cultivation in the sense that the Homestead Act required. Alaska described it as gardening in the sense that it was worth doing but would not feed you through the winter without everything else. The debate about whether the Homestead Act's extension to Alaska was a genuine land reform policy, or a poorly adapted application of continental agricultural assumptions to a landscape that those assumptions didn't fit, is one that Alaskan historians have engaged with carefully. The evidence suggests both were true simultaneously, genuine in its intent to open land to settlement, poorly adapted in its assumptions about what settlement in Alaska required and what it would produce. The claim is filed. The land is yours in the sense that the federal government can make it yours. Whether Alaska agrees is a separate question that the winter will answer. The cabin has to be done before the snow. Not finished. Done in the specific sense that it will keep you alive, which is a lower threshold than finished but a higher threshold than it sounds when you are standing in August on 160 acres of spruce forest with a set of plans that made sense in the lower 48, and a growing understanding that the plans require revision. The revision begins with the size. The cabin you planned was larger than the cabin you built, because the cabin you planned was planned by someone who had not yet understood that every additional square foot of interior space is additional cubic volume of air that the stove has to heat, and that the stove's capacity to heat air is finite, and the winter's capacity to remove heat from a structure is not. You build the cabin at 16 by 20 feet. Which is the size that experience and advice from the people who have done this longer than you have converges on as the practical minimum for two people to inhabit for a winter without losing the specific equanimity that a winter at this latitude requires. The logs are spruce. This is not a choice, it is a consequence of what is available. Spruce is everywhere in the Alaskan interior, in quantities that feel inexhaustible in August and that you will have specific opinions about by the time you have cut enough of them to build a cabin and a cache and a woodshed and the additional structures that the homestead requires. You learn to fell and limb and peel and notch and stack in the specific sequence that log cabin construction requires. And you learn it by doing it because the alternative is not doing it, and the alternative is not acceptable. The roof is the argument. Every person you consult has opinions about the roof pitch. Too steep and the snow slides off in avalanches that can injure anyone in the slide zone and damage the structures below. Too shallow and the snow accumulates in loads that test the structure's capacity. The pitch you settle on is the pitch that the most experienced person you can find recommends with the confidence of someone who has gotten this wrong before and understands the specific educational value of that experience. The historical record of Alaskan homestead construction is preserved partly in the buildings that survived and partly in the accounts of the buildings that didn't. The ones that didn't fail in specific ways that the builders, in retrospect, could identify and explain. The roof that couldn't hold the snow load of an unusual winter, the chinking that failed and emitted cold air in quantities that the stove couldn't compensate for, the foundation that settled unevenly when the permafrost shifted in the spring thaw. These failures were not the failures of incompetent people. They were the failures of people learning a specific and locally calibrated engineering practice in the only school available, which was the practice itself. The second cabin was almost always better than the first. The third was almost always better than the second. The knowledge accumulated through the specific mechanism of failure followed by understanding followed by correction. The sod roof is the fringe detail that the Alaskan homestead tradition developed from indigenous practice, and that the homesteaders of the settlement period adopted with varying degrees of success. A layer of living vegetation over the cabin roof provided insulation through the winter, and shed water effectively in the brief summer. The problem was the shoulder seasons, The spring thaw, specifically, when the sod was saturated with meltwater and carrying maximum weight before it had dried and before the summer warmth had fully arrived. Several weeks in May, the sod roof was simultaneously at its maximum load and its minimum structural integrity. The homesteaders who understood this prepared for it. The ones who didn't occasionally had the spring make a specific and dramatic argument about the relationship between water, weight, and structural capacity that required them to rebuild before they had fully recovered from winter. The debate about Alaskan homestead building knowledge is whether it constitutes a genuine folk engineering tradition, locally specific, empirically developed, transmitted through community and demonstrated through survival, or whether it represents the accumulated mistakes of people who would have been better served by formal training in the specific engineering challenges of subarctic construction. Both positions have evidence. The buildings that stood for decades argued for the tradition. The buildings that didn't argued for the training. The cabin is done. It is small and imperfect, and it is the most important thing you have ever built. The snow will tell you what you got wrong. You will fix it in spring. You cut what seems like enough wood in September. October suggests you were optimistic. This is not a dramatic revelation. It arrives gradually, the way most important Alaskan lessons arrive, not as a sudden shock but as a slow arithmetic that becomes undeniable after you have been doing the calculation long enough that the conclusion can no longer be avoided. The woodpile that looked substantial in the warm days of early October looks different in the cold days of late October, when the stove's consumption rate has increased with the temperature drop and the rate of increase is steeper than the planning assumed. You cut more wood in October. This is the correct response, and it is available to you in October in a way it will not be available in December, which is the thing that October is trying to tell you with the specific urgency of something that is giving you an opportunity, while the opportunity still exists. You cut more wood in October, and in November you count what you have with the attention you have been learning to give to the things that stand between you and the consequences of insufficient planning. The wood supply is the clearest expression of the homestead's fundamental arithmetic. You have a stove with a known capacity. You have a winter with an approximately known length, and a variably known severity. You have a woodpile with a countable quantity. The calculation is simple and the variables are real, and the margin for error is the gap between what you have and what a severe winter requires. And a severe winter, in the Alaskan interior, is not an exceptional event. It is a possibility that every winter contains and that some winters deliver fully. The historical grounding on wood consumption in Alaskan homesteads is specific. A well-built 16 by 20 foot cabin with a properly functioning stove required approximately 10 to 15 cords of firewood for a winter of average severity at interior Alaskan temperatures. A cord is a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of stacked wood. Cutting, splitting, and stacking 10 to 15 cords required approximately 6 to 8 weeks of full-time work, which meant the entire month of September and most of October were wood months, conducted against the knowledge that the window for cutting and drying wood before the deep freeze closed with the same inexorability as everything else in the Alaskan seasonal calendar. The fringe detail is the hyperlocal knowledge that experienced Alaskan woodcutters developed about tree selection that was never written in any manual, and that could not be written in any manual because it was too specific to local conditions to generalize. The difference between dry standing dead spruce and wet standing dead spruce, which looked nearly identical from a distance but burned with dramatically different efficiency. The specific forest locations where fuel wood of the best quality concentrated, determined by drainage patterns and wind exposure, and the history of the forest that only long observation could reveal. The species preferences that local conditions established. Birch where it was available burning hotter than spruce, but spruce available everywhere and birch available only in specific locations. This knowledge was not published. It was transmitted between neighbors and across generations in the specific oral tradition of people whose survival depended on knowing it. A new homesteader who asked the right questions of the right experienced neighbors received information that took those neighbors years to accumulate. A new homesteader who didn't ask or didn't have access to experienced neighbors learned the same information through the same mechanism that produced it originally, which was experience, at the cost that experience charges. The debate about the wood-centered life of Alaskan homesteaders is one that touches a broader question about human relationships with the material sources of survival. The position that the daily management of the fuel supply produced a quality of attention to the physical environment, a continuous, calibrated awareness of resource and consumption and reserve that the modern heated home has eliminated, is argued by people who live this life and by historians who study it. The position that this attention was not enriching but consuming, that it occupied cognitive and emotional resources that might have been better deployed elsewhere, is argued by people who consider the liberation from material anxiety a genuine advance in human welfare. You count the cords in December the way you count money when you're not sure you have enough. Carefully. Twice. And then you cut back on something. The sun sets at 3:15 in the afternoon, and you have been awake for 10 hours and the day is over. This is November. It will get shorter before it gets longer. You understood this before you came. The intellectual understanding of Alaskan winter darkness is available to anyone who looks at a globe and thinks about axial tilt and the relationship between latitude and the angle at which sunlight reaches the Earth's surface. The intellectual understanding is not the same as the experience, which is a distinction that Alaska makes very clearly for the people who arrive here in possession of the intellectual version and the assumption that it is sufficient preparation for the experiential one. It is not sufficient preparation. The darkness at 62 degrees north in December is not the darkness of a short winter day in the northern continental states, where the sun sets early but set at a height and angle that allows some residual light to remain useful for a period after the formal sunset. In the Alaskan interior in December, the sun rises at 10 in the morning at an angle low enough that the trees and the terrain intercept it before it clears the horizon in large sections of the landscape. It sets at 2:30 or 3. The light it provides during the hours it is technically above the horizon has the quality of late afternoon light in October in other places, present but brief, already leaving, already pointing toward the darkness that follows. You have 4 hours of usable daylight on a clear day. On an overcast day, which is not an exceptional occurrence in the Alaskan interior in December, you have 4 hours of gray. The historical documentation of darkness adaptation in Alaskan homestead communities is preserved in the journals that homesteaders kept with a frequency that reflects the writing toward the outside impulse that isolation produces. The journals describe the progression of darkness adaptation with the specific attention of people observing their own psychological states from the inside, the initial strangeness, the disruption of sleep patterns, the specific flatness that the first weeks of full darkness produced, and then, in the people who survived it, and wrote about surviving it, the adaptation. The adaptation was not comfortable. It was functional. The distinction matters because the comfortable version of adaptation, the story where people adjusted happily to the darkness, and found it peaceful and enriching, is not the version the journals describe. The journals describe people who learned to function in conditions that they did not prefer, through strategies that they developed deliberately because the conditions required deliberate strategies. The fringe detail about Alaskan light management is the one that anticipated modern light therapy by decades without the theoretical framework that would eventually explain why it worked. Homesteaders positioned their work areas near windows with a deliberateness that was not about aesthetics. Windows were placed and work surfaces arranged to maximize exposure to the available daylight during the hours it existed. Reflective surfaces, white painted walls, mirrors where they could be afforded, metal surfaces that caught and redirected light, were used inside cabins to amplify the limited natural light. Work schedules were arranged around the light with a priority that overrode other scheduling considerations. Outdoor work was conducted during daylight hours regardless of whether the indoor work that could have been done in those hours was more urgent. These were light management strategies. They worked by maximizing the phototherapy effect of available natural light on the circadian systems of people whose circadian systems were being disrupted by the photoperiod. The homesteaders didn't know this. They knew that the strategies helped, and they used them with the pragmatic commitment of people who used what worked without requiring an explanation of why it worked. The debate about darkness adaptation and psychological resilience is genuine and unresolved. The position that Alaskan homestead life produced people with an expanded tolerance for conditions that modern populations find debilitating is supported by the survival data. The people who stayed, and their journals suggest they found ways to inhabit the darkness that the people who left did not find. The position that the culture of self-sufficiency and the social sanction against expressing difficulty normalized damage that should have been identified and addressed is also supported by the record of people who left, or who stayed and deteriorated in ways that their own accounts document with the specific honesty of people writing for themselves rather than for an audience. The darkness is not what you fight. It is what you inhabit. The people who fight it lose. The people who find a way to live in it survive until the light comes back, which it always does, in the specific reliable way of things that have been doing this longer than you have. At 40 below, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Not metaphorically. Not as a warning that approximates the risk for rhetorical effect. As a physical description of what the temperature does to unprotected human tissue in the time it takes to walk from the cabin to the woodshed and back if you have forgotten your gloves. You do not forget your gloves twice. The cold at 40 below is not the cold that the word cold describes in most of the world. It is a different physical environment with different physical laws that govern every task, every piece of equipment, every decision about whether to go outside and what to do when you get there. Metal at 40 below conducts heat away from skin so efficiently that bare skin on metal produces the specific injury that the word burn describes, which is physiologically accurate. The tissue damage from extreme cold and extreme heat are not as different as the temperature scales suggest. Rubber at 40 below becomes brittle in ways that matter when the rubber is a seal, or a boot's sole, or a component of a machine you need to function. Batteries lose significant capacity. Diesel fuel thickens toward gel. The lubricants that allow mechanical systems to function at normal temperatures stop functioning at the temperatures they were not designed for. The homesteader at 40 below is operating in conditions that most of the technology available to them was not designed for. They developed protocols. The historical detail about extreme cold management in Alaskan homestead practice is preserved in the specific and practical literature that the community produced. The advice columns in the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, the Extension Service publications, the word-of-mouth transmission of what work that constitutes the real curriculum of subarctic living. The layering system for cold weather clothing was understood and practiced with a sophistication that modern outdoor clothing technology has formalized but not substantially improved. The specific order of putting on layers mattered: moisture management next to the skin, insulation in the middle, wind protection on the outside, with the sequence of donning them organized to prevent sweating during the donning process because moisture in the insulation layer reduced its effectiveness, and wet insulation at 40 below was a problem of a different order than wet insulation at normal temperatures. The fringe detail is the convergence point. Minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 40 degrees Celsius are the same temperature. The two scales that measure cold in different units agree at this specific point, and nowhere else. Alaskan homesteaders knew this. The minus 40 convergence was a psychological marker, not a formal threshold with formal rules attached to it, but a number that both measurement systems endorsed as significant, a temperature that the thermometer announced in the same terms regardless of which scale you read it in. On minus 40 days, the experienced homesteaders stayed inside unless staying inside was itself the emergency. Not because of a rule. Because the accumulated experience of the community had produced a collective understanding that minus 40 was the temperature at which the cost-benefit calculation of going outside shifted decisively towards staying in. And that the protocols which managed the cost-benefit calculation at minus 20 and minus 30 became insufficient at minus 40 in ways that the people who had tested them at minus 40 understood specifically. The debate about human adaptability to extreme cold is one that the Alaskan homestead experience illuminates without fully resolving. The physiological evidence is clear that humans can learn to function at temperatures that would be dangerous to unprepared people. The protocols, the equipment, the specific knowledge of cold management that Alaskan homesteaders develop constitute a genuine expansion of the range within which human beings can operate effectively. Whether this represents biological adaptation or purely cultural adaptation, whether the bodies of people who spent generations in these conditions changed in ways that made the conditions easier, or whether the knowledge alone was sufficient, is a question that the research has not fully answered. You dress in the specific order that 40 below requires, and you go out for the specific reason that requires going out, and you come back in before the cold has taken what it will take if you stay out too long. This is not bravery. This is the protocol. You follow it every time because the one time you don't is the time that matters. The root cellar is your second stove. It keeps things from freezing instead of from cooling, which is the Alaskan inversion of the continental preservation problem and the thing that people who arrive in Alaska with continental food storage assumptions get wrong with the most reliable consistency. In the lower 48, the cellar keeps food cool enough to prevent spoilage. In interior Alaska, the cellar keeps food warm enough to prevent freezing, which is a different engineering problem solved by the same structural principle of using the Earth's thermal mass, but in the opposite direction. The permafrost complicates this. Permafrost is permanently frozen ground that underlies most of the Alaskan interior at varying depths. Above it, a layer of active soil thaws and refreezes seasonally. The root cellar has to be dug to a depth that puts it below the seasonal freeze but above the permafrost, a zone of thermal stability that maintains temperatures just above freezing through the winter. Getting this depth wrong in either direction produces a cellar that either freezes your vegetables or sits in permafrost that heaves and shifts with the seasonal temperature changes in ways that are destructive to the structure and the contents. You learn the depth by asking people who have already learned it. The cache is the other storage structure that the Alaskan homestead required and that the continental homestead tradition did not. A small elevated platform on tall smooth-capped posts, the cache stored the food that needed to be kept frozen, the meat from the fall hunt, the fish from the summer runs, the additional provisions whose preservation the outdoor temperatures guaranteed for free for 7 months of the year. The design kept the contents above the reach of bears, which were interested in the cache's contents with a persistence and intelligence that the homesteaders respected and accounted for in the cache's construction. The historical detail about Alaskan homestead food systems is one of the most carefully documented aspects of the life because food was the most concrete expression of the year's labor, and the most direct indicator of whether the homestead was viable. The combination of subsistence hunting, fishing, gardening, and purchase provisions that sustained an Alaskan homestead through the winter was a supply chain of considerable complexity that the homesteader managed personally, from the spring planting through the fall harvest and the winter consumption. The salmon runs were the anchor of the protein supply for many homesteaders. The Alaskan rivers produced salmon in quantities that the continental visitor found difficult to believe and that the homesteader translated into hundreds of pounds of preserved protein through drying, smoking, and canning in the weeks when the runs were at their peak. Missing the salmon run, through illness, equipment failure, or the specific bad luck of a run that arrived earlier or later than expected, was a food security event that required adjustment to the rest of the year's planning. The fringe detail is the relationship between the Alaskan homestead food system and the indigenous Alaskan food systems that the homesteaders learned from, borrowed from, and occasionally misunderstood. The cache design was adapted from indigenous practice. The preservation methods for salmon, the specific drying and smoking techniques that produce safe, shelf-stable protein, were learned from or developed in parallel with the techniques that indigenous Alaskans had refined over thousands of years in the same environment. The homesteaders who established productive relationships with indigenous neighbors and learned from that knowledge fared better than the ones who didn't, in ways that the survival records reflect without always being explicit about the source of the advantage. The debate about the Alaskan homesteaders' relationship with their food supply and whether its intimacy represented a healthier relationship with food than the modern commodity version is one that tends to generate more heat than light because it touches contemporary anxieties about food systems and disconnection from the sources of sustenance. What the historical record shows is that the homesteaders thought about food constantly, managed it carefully, and experienced its seasonal abundance and scarcity with an immediacy that the modern food system is designed to eliminate. Whether the elimination is progress depends on what you think the management of that immediacy cost and what it produced. You know exactly what you have and exactly what you need, and the gap between them is the number you think about in February. In March the gap is closing. In April it doesn't matter anymore because the ptarmigan are back. 11 miles in summer is a morning. 11 miles in February is a decision. Not a difficult decision, necessarily, The 11 miles can be traveled in winter and is traveled, regularly, by people who have the equipment and the knowledge and the specific motivation that February provides for human contact after weeks of the specific quiet that an Alaskan homestead in winter produces. But it is a decision in the way that things are decisions when they require planning and preparation and a calculation of conditions and risks that a morning walk in summer does not require. You plan the visit the way you plan anything in February, with attention to the weather, which has opinions, and the trail conditions, which reflect the weather's opinions in physical form, and the daylight, which limits the available travel window to the specific hours when going somewhere and coming back is possible without the complication of doing part of the journey in the dark, which is a complication with consequences. The neighbors are the Hendersons. They came to their claim 2 years before you came to yours, which means they have 2 more winters of Alaskan education than you have, which means the 11 miles is worth traveling for reasons beyond the social ones. You carry questions the way you carry provisions, things you need that the journey will supply. The Hendersons carry their own questions back in the other direction when they come to you. The exchange is the point. Not the charity of experienced people helping inexperienced ones, though there is an element of that, but the genuine mutual benefit of an information-sharing relationship between people who are all learning the same curriculum in slightly different classrooms. The historical documentation of Alaskan homestead community is scattered across the personal records, the journals, the letters, the oral histories recorded in later decades, that capture the social texture of lives lived at distances that the continental experience of community doesn't fully illuminate. The homestead communities of the Alaskan interior were sparse in ways that the word community, with its implications of proximity and casual contact, doesn't quite capture. They were networks of significant distances between nodes of human habitation, connected by trails and radio, and the specific visiting pattern that the seasons allowed. The community institutions that existed in the nearest towns, the trading post, the roadhouse, the community hall where dances and meetings happened, were reached on the occasions when the journey was possible and warranted. These occasions were not frequent in winter and were anticipated with the specific enthusiasm of people who had been in small groups or alone for extended periods and for whom the noise and crowding that urban people escape to wilderness to avoid represented an experience they actively sought. The fringe detail is the bush telegraph, the informal communication system that Alaskan homestead communities developed for welfare monitoring and information transmission in the years before radio was widespread and reliable. Notes left at trail junctions for whoever passed. Messages sent through mail carriers who moved between homesteads and could carry word in both directions. The smoke from a cabin chimney as a welfare indicator. A cabin showing smoke was a cabin with a living fire, which was a cabin with a living occupant, and a cabin showing no smoke for 2 days in February was a cabin that warranted investigation. The smoke signal is the most efficient version of the welfare check system. It required no technology beyond the fire that the cabin needed anyway. It was observable from a distance that the human eye could cover in a scan. It communicated binary information, smoke or no smoke, living or possibly not living, with the specificity that the welfare monitoring application required. The homesteaders who paid attention to their neighbors' smoke were not performing an optional kindness. They were participating in a mutual monitoring system whose reliability depended on everyone's participation and whose purpose was the survival of the community understood as a set of individuals whose fates were connected by proximity and shared conditions. The debate about Alaskan homestead community and whether its enforced interdependence produced stronger social bonds than the voluntary communities of modern life is one that tends to romanticize in one direction or the other. The romantic version sees frontier community as a model of genuine mutual support that modern atomized society has lost. The skeptical version sees frontier community as necessity masquerading as virtue, people being interdependent because they had no choice and the interdependence ending as soon as the necessity did. The evidence suggests something more complicated. The bonds formed in Alaskan homestead communities were real and some of them persisted for decades after the homesteads themselves were abandoned or sold. They were also formed under conditions that excluded the people who couldn't tolerate the conditions, which means the community that remained was a self-selected group of people with specific temperamental affinities that may have made the bonding easier regardless of the circumstances. You spend 3 days at the Hendersons and the conversation is worth every step of the 11 miles there and back. You carry it home with you like extra wood. It burns slower than wood but it warms the same. The mail comes when it comes. In winter this means it comes when the conditions allow it, which is not the same as when you need it. The bush plane that delivers mail to the remote homesteads and settlements of the Alaskan interior operates on the logic of weather and visibility, and the specific calculation that the pilot makes about whether the flight is possible and worth making on any given day. On the days when the calculation produces yes, the mail comes. On the days when it produces no, you wait. The waiting is not comfortable. But it is the condition. A letter from your mother, written in the 3rd week of November in the kitchen of the house you grew up in, arrives at your homestead in the 2nd week of December. The 3-week gap between writing and receiving is the physical distance between her world and yours expressed in time, which is the form that distance takes when you have no telephone and the radio is for emergencies and the mail is the medium through which the continuous negotiation of connection between you and the world you came from is conducted. You read the letter twice when it arrives. Then you read it again in the evening when the stove is going and the lamp is lit and the ward duties of the day are done. The 3rd reading is not for new information. You know what the letter says after the 1st reading. The 3rd reading is for the presence that the letter approximates. The specific way your mother writes, the rhythm of her sentences, the things she notices and reports, the news of people and places that exist in the world outside the 45-mile radius of your daily life, is a presence that the physical object of the letter carries across the distance. The historical documentation of Alaskan homestead letter writing is among the richest archives that the homestead period produced, for the specific reason that the isolation that made letters necessary also made the writers more attentive to what they were writing. The letter that was the primary form of connection to a distant world was not written casually. It was written with the attention you give to things that cost something to send and that will be received by people who will read them with the attention of people for whom letters are not casual. The journals that Alaskan homesteaders kept served a related but distinct function. The journal was the communication that had no recipient, or whose recipient was the future self, or posterity, or simply the act of putting experience into language that made it legible in ways that the living of it alone didn't fully accomplish. The homesteaders who kept journals did so with a consistency that isolation sustained and with an attention to detail that the reduced radius of daily experience encouraged. When your world is the cabin and the woodpile and the 11 miles to the nearest neighbor, the details of that world fill the record in ways that the wider world's details don't, because there is nothing to crowd them out. The fringe detail is what the journals reveal about the phenomenology of Alaskan winter, the specific texture of days that the outside world had no context for and that the journals therefore describe with an explicitness that the writers might not have deployed if they had assumed their readers understood the context. The quality of light at 2 in the afternoon in December. The specific sound that extreme cold makes, the cracking of the trees, which is not dramatic but is constant and takes some adjustment to understand as benign. The particular silence of a landscape with several feet of snow that has absorbed the frequencies that ambient noise normally occupies. These details exist in the journals because the writers were paying attention in the specific way that people pay attention when the range of available experience is narrow, and the experience within that range is consequently more closely observed. The debate about isolation and inner life, whether the Alaskan homestead experience produced a richer relationship with the immediate environment and with one's own thoughts, or whether it produced a narrowing of the world that was limiting rather than deepening, is one that the journals both illuminate and complicate. They illuminate it because they are evidence of rich inner lives. They complicate it because the people who kept detailed journals may not have been representative of the homestead population generally. They may have been the people who were suited to the inner life that the isolation produced, and the people who weren't suited to it left without leaving journals. The letter is 3 weeks old when it arrives. The person who wrote it has lived 3 more weeks since then and is different in ways the letter can't account for. You read it anyway. You read it twice. The distance between you is measured in weeks, not miles. The dogs know things about the winter that you are still learning. This is not a romantic observation. It is a practical one, made by someone who has been watching the lead dog's behavior for 2 winters and has accumulated enough correlations between specific behaviors and subsequent weather events to treat the dog's assessment of atmospheric conditions as data. The lead dog's name is irrelevant to this account but was important to the dog, who responded to it with the specific dignity of an animal that had been doing its job since before you arrived and intended to continue doing it after you had learned enough to be a competent partner in the operation. You learned to read the dog the way you learned to read the wood supply and the food cellar and the smoke from the neighbor's chimney, as a source of information that the environment provided and that the practical person used. Sled dogs in the Alaskan interior were not pets with a recreational purpose. They were the primary transportation technology available for travel over snow in the period before snowmobiles became accessible, and the technology they represented was sophisticated in ways that the word technology undersells. A good dog team was a capital asset of significant value, trained animals, bred for specific capabilities, managed with the care that valuable and necessary equipment requires. The knowledge of dog care, training, and management was a specialized body of expertise with its own oral tradition, its own standards, its own accumulated wisdom about what made a good team and what made a good lead dog and what the difference between the two was. The historical record of sled dog management in Alaskan homestead communities is preserved partly in the practical literature, the advice that circulated through the community about breeding, feeding, training, and the specific medical care that working dogs required, and partly in the personal accounts of homesteaders who described their dog teams with the attention that you give to things whose performance your survival depends on. The accounts are notably free of sentimentality, not because the homesteaders didn't value their dogs. The evidence is that they valued them considerably, but because sentimentality and practical necessity occupied different registers in the Alaskan winter, and the practical register dominated the record. The fringe detail about sled dogs and weather prediction is one that the homesteaders documented with a consistency that makes it difficult to dismiss as coincidence or selective memory. The specific behaviors that indicated approaching weather, the restlessness before a storm, the specific change in howling patterns, the tendency to cache food before a significant cold snap, were observed across multiple accounts from different periods and locations with enough agreement to suggest that the behaviors were real and the predictions were better than chance. The mechanism proposed by modern animal behavior research involves sensitivity to barometric pressure, which dogs can detect through their inner ear at thresholds below human perception. A significant drop in barometric pressure, which precedes storm systems, produces behavioral changes in dogs that their handlers learn to read as weather indicators. The homesteaders who relied on these predictions were not relying on mysticism. They were relying on the dog's access to meteorological data that human senses couldn't directly perceive. The debate about the working relationship between Alaskan homesteaders and their dogs is one that touches the broader question of what interspecies collaboration means and what it requires. The practical relationship, dogs providing transportation, early warning, and companionship in exchange for food, shelter, and care, was genuinely mutual in the sense that both parties got something they needed from it. Whether this mutuality constitutes the kind of relationship that the word partnership implies, with its suggestions of comparable agency and comparable stake in the outcome, is a question that the dogs are not available to answer and that the historical record approaches only from the human side. The lead dog turns toward home before you have decided to turn toward home. You follow. This is the correct order of things in a blizzard 11 miles from the cabin. The dog knows where home is. You know that the dog knows. This is enough. The light comes back the way it always comes back. Gradually, and then all at once. The gradual part happens through January and February, in increments too small to feel significant on any individual day but cumulative enough that by the end of February the difference from the December low is measurable in hours and felt in the specific way that things are felt when you have been waiting for them long enough that their arrival is not ordinary. The sun that appears above the horizon in late January and climbs to an angle where it actually illuminates the landscape rather than simply existing at the edge of it. This sun is not the same sun that you took for granted in August. It is the sun that cost the winter. You mark the increments. The journal records them with an attention that the summer sun never receives. Because the summer sun is always there and the winter sun is the one that is returning from somewhere it was not, and whose return you have been tracking since the December low. The first day the sun is visible above the tree line from the cabin window. The first afternoon when the light lasts past 3 o'clock. The first morning when the temperature at dawn is above zero for the first time in weeks. These are not casual observations. They are the evidence of a winter being survived. The breakup, the period when the rivers thaw and the ice moves and the landscape transforms from frozen white to brown and then to green, is the most beautiful and the most dangerous season in the Alaskan calendar. The beauty is obvious, the release from months of cold and dark expressed in the most dramatic visual terms available. The danger is less discussed but real. The rivers in breakup carry ice in quantities and at forces that the word flood doesn't fully capture. The ice jams that form and release, the flooding that arrives faster and higher than you wait out the breakup the way you waited out the February cold, with the specific patience of someone who has learned that waiting is not passive but is itself a form of management, the management of the impulse to act before conditions support action. The historical documentation of Alaskan homestead springs in the personal record has a quality that is distinct from the documentation of winter. The winter journals are careful and specific and often spare, the writing of people conserving energy, including the energy of expression. The spring journals are different. They run longer. The descriptions are more expansive. The observation of the returning world, the first open water, the first birdsong, the first patch of ground visible through the snow, the specific sequence of species returning to the landscape in the order that the homesteaders learned to expect, fills pages that the winter entries did not fill. The spring is the season that the winter made worth describing. The fringe detail is the specific markers that Alaskan homesteaders use to track the progress of spring in the absence of the calendar's authority over the actual weather. The calendar said April. The landscape said what it said, which was sometimes April and sometimes late March and sometimes early May, depending on the year and the specific microclimatic conditions of the homestead's location. The homesteaders tracked the real spring through biological indicators, the return of specific bird species that arrived in a reliable sequence, the behavior of the river ice, the specific angle of the sun that made outdoor work possible without full cold weather gear, rather than through the calendar. Because the calendar didn't know about this winter specifically and the biological indicators did. The debate about whether the experience of an Alaskan winter genuinely enhances the experience of the subsequent spring, whether the difficulty of the dark months creates a quality of appreciation for the returning light that people who haven't experienced polar winter cannot access, is one that the homesteaders tended to answer in the affirmative with a conviction that skeptics attribute to rationalization and defenders attribute to experience. The honest answer is probably both. The returning light after a genuine Alaskan winter is experienced as something extraordinary by the people who have lived through what preceded it. Whether this represents an enhanced capacity for appreciation that the winter produced or simply the relief of suffering ending that any suffering's ending produces is a distinction that the experience itself doesn't clearly make. You filed the claim in August. The winter taught you what the claim required. It taught you about wood, not the abstract knowledge of how much a winter needs but the specific knowledge of this winter, this stove, this woodpile, this margin. It taught you about darkness, not the fact of polar darkness but the daily practice of inhabiting it, the strategies that work and the ones that don't and the difference between fighting it and living in it. It taught you about cold, the protocols that make 40 below manageable and the specific respect you extend to temperatures that the protocols manage but do not eliminate. It taught you about food, the arithmetic of stores and consumption, and the gap between them in February. It taught you about neighbors, what 11 miles means when the alternative is no one. It taught you about animals, what the lead dog knows that you don't, and how to use what it knows. It taught you about letters, what it means to receive one when receiving one costs something and to hold it like the presents it approximates. These are not things you could have learned anywhere else. The spring tells you whether you learn them. You are still here. The cabin is still standing. The woodpile got you through. The root cellar held. The cache held. The dogs are fine. The neighbors are fine. The mail came when it came and you read it when it arrived and it was enough. That is the proof. Not triumph. not the dramatic vindication of a bet against difficult odds. Something quieter and more durable than triumph. Continuity. The land accepting that you have learned its terms. You walk out into the April morning and the sun is at an angle it hasn't been at since September, and the air smells of something other than cold for the first time in months, and somewhere above the treeline there is a bird that wasn't there yesterday. You stand in the yard and you listen to it. You have earned the listening. The winter is behind you. The next one is ahead. You know what it requires now. That is the whole of it. That is enough. Thanks for drifting off with us tonight. If this helped you rest, hit subscribe. Drop your city and time in the comments. And wherever you are, whatever the temperature outside your window, I hope your woodpile is sufficient and your neighbors are close enough. Good night.